Our country is collapsing. The American working class finds it harder than ever to make ends meet with their pay at the end of the month. What are our politicians' response? Sending billions to neo Nazis in Ukraine and to Zionists in Israel, carrying out a genocide the whole world, including the American people, want to see an end to? Why is it that our government always has money for war, but never for the people? Who do they represent? Are we actually sovereign if capital is the one in the driver's seat? Prophetic as he always was, the great American political theorist Michael Parenti noted how, in times of imperial crisis, we see clearly how the empire feeds off the republic, how imperial quests around the world are waged on the backs of things collapsing back home. This is the subject of today's broadcast. First, we will speak with Teamster steward and Midwestern Mark's chief labor analyst, Kyle Pettis, who will tell us about the recent developments in the labor movement, primary of which is the historic organizing of a Volkswagen plant in Tennessee. Then, we will be speaking with the sort of individual you will never hear of in mainstream media and parts of the so called independent leftist media, our good friend Slava, a Ukrainian Marxist Leninist. Yes, you heard that correctly. A correspondent for our good friends over at the Revolution Report and a member of the Chicago's Workers' School. You are not going to want to miss this one, folks, so stick around. We'll get started right after this. All right, welcome, folks. How you doing, Kyle?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing very good. It's glad to have you back on. It's been quite a bit since we brought you back. Our specialist in the labor movement, the individual that knows more about what's going on in the labor movement that I know of in this country. We had a very historic development recently in the organizing of a Volkswagen plant down in Tennessee. This was something that in the conversations we've had previously, I think I know you're not one to brag, but it's something that you have explicitly mentioned because you've been following this so closely for so many years. But do you want to tell us a little bit about what happened in the Tennessee Volkswagen plant? How is it historic, and how could it have been predicted if you would have had the historical understanding of these unfoldings that you yourself hold?
Yeah, so a little bit of back information. Of course, I think the last time I was on here, I was talking about Sean Fain's big move to um, go forth and organize all of these plants that have not had a union in the United States. Um, and Volkswagen is top of the list. They had attempted Volkswagen. This is the third attempt, and this was the successful attempt. And So the first attempt was in 2013, if I remember correctly, uh, 2014, and it failed mainly due to the fact that Senator Senator Bob Crocker of Tennessee had come out publicly saying, using the full power, he was a U.S. senator, using the full power of his position to call on people in the who were working at the plant to vote no, which was a strange turn of events to see in 2014. It's kind of reminiscent of something from the 50s or 60s of a public union busting campaign. Usually these are private affairs, but of course, paired with the strange Crocker statements against the unionization effort at Volkswagen by the UAW, was also paired, of course, by a lot of private business groups in the area that were worried that if the Volkswagen plant went union, that other industries in the area would also go union. So the first attempt was not really refuted by Volkswagen itself. It had Volkswagen is a highly unionized company internationally, and they had a kind of agreement with the union. It was called a neutrality sort of clause, whereby they wouldn't directly uh, go against the union's efforts to organize the plant, but there were a lot of limitations, like, for example, UAW staff couldn't enter the plant to talk to workers. They couldn't talk to workers at home. It had to kind of be a grassroots sort of thing. But paired with public pressure from the senator at the time, and also these private business groups, the there was a essentially the vote law was lost to unionize the plant the first time. Then we had the second attempt, which was in 2016, if I remember correctly. Uh, 2015 was the second attempt, and this time the UAW, and this was all pre-Sean Fain, of course, so this was different leadership. They went for an effort to unionize one specific sector, which was the skilled trades workers at the plant, which would have been the maintenance men, engineers, and stuff like that. They actually won their vote, but Volkswagen, because of the public pressure from last time and everything else, went back on their neutrality agreement with the union and refused to negotiate a contract for these workers. And so, yeah, that was the situation that we found ourselves going into this latest round of these negotiations, and these latest rounds of unionization efforts across the board. And I had because of the narrow, sort of margin that the first time the plant had tried to unionize that it lost by, and following that unionization of that one group without recognition from the company and with no contract, Volkswagen actually attempted, or the UAW actually attempted to organize the entire plant in a show of force, which ultimately failed once again by, I believe it was 1 or 2%. It was a really, really close run thing. And so my prediction when Sean Fain announced that he was going to be going out and organizing new plants was the first thing I said, Carlos, I'm sure you remember, was Volkswagen Tennessee is going to be the one. And sure enough, here we are. On April 22nd, it was announced that 73% of the auto workers at Volkswagen Tennessee had voted to join the union, and it was ratified. And they're going to be entering into negotiations with Volkswagen itself. And you love to see it. Sean Fain clearly, once again, coming out with the strong leadership, able to pull this off where previously the UAW had failed. A lot of these workers were seeing what was happening with the negotiations from the big three, where Sean Fain was leading the strike against General Motors, Stellantis, and Ford. And they saw a lot of those gains that were made by the workers at those plants, and they want in on the action. So here they are, first plant already, and it's not even been a year, and he's already got one of massive plant. And this is actually once again another historical record gained by Sean Fain and the UAW, which is the first automotive plant in the South to be organized that is a foreign manufacturer, and it's a very big deal. And also on top of that, they haven't had a single auto manufacturer plant in the South organized, domestic or foreign, but domestic since the 1940s. So this is setting a really big precedent. People are kind of waking up and getting that trade union consciousness, and we love to see it. Shout out, props to Sean Fain and the all of the men and women of the UAW that are behind him, and sort of reinventing a new strategy for organized labor across the board, exiting this period of what they call fortress unionism, which was when what we've seen for the last several decades in the United States with the trade union movement, which is just constantly being on the defense. Sean Fain is in the team behind him. I don't want to downplay. It's not the great man of history. It's not just Sean Fain, but a lot of great organizers at UAW who are putting in a lot of work to come up with a new strategy for organized labor in this country and really pushing forward and bringing the fight to the capitalists themselves and actually making some very big gains for the working class across the board. The second that the contracts were ratified with the big three, every single auto manufacturer in this country instituted raises across the board to try and pacify their workers from the oncoming, onslaught from the UAW. And I don't think they're going to buy it. I think they're ready to go. I think that this is just the start. I know that there's been efforts at some Toyota plants, some Nissan plants as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if this latest Volkswagen victory fuels the flames for even more factories to get on board.
Yeah, that's what historically I think we see. It's kind of like a one of the Rocky films. When he gets the first couple punches in, all the other ones come out after that. You know, you build up confidence. Workers around the country see that it's possible, that you could do it, that it's worth doing, and then they start doing it. But I want to mention just real quick for the folks in the audience that Kyle has to have a magic 8 ball or something under his bed that he's been hiding from us because his predictive capacities are just insane. When the surgical stand-up strike, again, another great example of creative militant unionism on the part of Sean Fain and the UAW leadership. When that strike was announced, one of the plants that Kyle suggested will be organized was Wentzville, Missouri. And we were on the phone when Fain was announcing the first few the first few plants, and the first one was Wentzville, Missouri, and we went absolutely berserk. We went bananas, as Noah would say. Um, and now this, after Sean Fain mentioned that they're coming for all other automobile industries and they're going to unionize the shit out of the industry, which is such a central productive industry for the country. Again, he mentioned that this was going to be one of the first ones. So an incredible capacity given to him, not just by the fact that he's on the ground, he's following these events, but also that he's a Marxist. That's a little, when you become a genuine Marxist, you get the magic 8 ball as Kyle has. Kyle, I think you've mentioned a good distinction between the previous unionization attempts at this plant and the ones that just occurred under the leadership and guidance, of course, of Sean Fain and this new, more radical militant wing of the UAW. Can you speak a little bit about the contrast in the two approaches? You mentioned, the move away from fortress unionism to more militant unionism, but how can similar strategic turns be implemented in other industries and or in other plants and in other companies? And do you see that happening?
Yeah, so kind of to highlight some of the characteristics of what we're seeing with this new union strategy, it's very much an appeal publicly to working class people in for the UAW who's pioneering this. That means automotive workers. Famously, when Sean Fain was doing his, whole UAW was doing a victory lap after the win at the Big Three. He instantly was putting out, sort of agitational propaganda to workers in automotive industry across the nation, no matter where they're at, appealing to the workers directly, using social media, using news outlets, everything, trying to put directly to the workers the idea of joining the UAW and trying to foster this grassroots movements from within these factories from afar, and then sending in his organizing teams to go and work with these grassroots sort of leadership councils that are already formed up organically amongst the working class people at these plants. So it's a very remarkably different strategy than what we've seen in several decades here in the United States. Everything how you used to organize a plant was people at the plant would decide one day for whatever reason they wanted to join the union, and it was very much an underground thing. There was no, being open about it. You would try to talk to as many coworkers as you could, try to get as many people to sign a union card. It was a very slow process, and it was very much not very productive. We really didn't see from this sort of strategy a lot of big successes. Um, this new capitalization of social media, and the ability for the union to create its own media to put out, remarkable sort of pairing. It's really 21st century organizing. He's very cutting edge with this stuff, and I think it's um, I think it's important to also realize that Sean Fain's, whole thing that he's been going through, and the people behind him at the UAW who support him, this whole his whole message has been empowering the rank and file, and that pairs perfectly with trying to get people to organize, because the people who are organizing the union on the ground, who are the employees at this place, they have a vested interest in being democratically active within the union. They have a vested interest in continuing to keep up and attend union meetings and things like that. We're seeing a full revival of the beginnings of what led into the golden era of the unions in this country. And I'm hoping that Sean Fain continues to gain momentum, and we see a second golden age of unionization in this country, and strong, maybe a return to civic unionism, where union members are much more heavily involved and view their union as a community, rank and file participation up, working class democracy within the unions, things that have been sorely missing and lacking in this country for decades at this point. Um, it's incredible to see, and I have high hopes for all of this. And I think that people like Sean Fain, they have and once again, the team behind him, I think they have the foresight to really make this happen. And we're seeing more emphasis on this type of unionism across the board. I mean, obviously, I'm a Teamster. Sean O'Brien, under his leadership, he implemented his own form of an aggressive strategy with UPS directly before the Big Three. I think that gave a lot of credence to this turning point in American labor history of no more fortress unionism. We have to go forward. Um, it's incredible, and the Big Three was obviously a massive success. The Big Three automotive UAW strike was a massive success, and I think that the general population in this country is very much ready to be organized. It doesn't matter what sector they're in. I think that specifically when blue collar workers in the United States, like the UAW, like Teamsters, like all types of trades, uh, they speak for general labor. I mean, that's really how it is. Any worker in any sector can look at what industrial automotive workers are doing and pulling off, and they feel a connection to that through the fact that they're working class as well. So we have to understand that the general labor sentiment and blue collar trades across this country is very much turning pro union very rapidly. And that is, I mean, if you had made a poll in the 90s of blue collar tradesmen, if they wanted to be in the union, I guarantee you the vast majority would have said no. I think today, I've seen studies 60-70% of blue collar workers saying they want to join the union. I mean, it's insane. And at the same time, less than 10% of private sector workers in this country are organized. So yes, I have an awful camera. I really have to change this, but I got to work more for that. So um, yeah, so there's a lot of momentum, and I think it's going to continue to grow, and I think it's going to continue to snowball, and I have high hopes, and I think that more and more individual unions will be getting on board with this, and I think we'll see more Sean Fains and different unions kind of taking leadership. I think it's, like I said, this isn't great man of history. I think this is a time, and this is dialectics in motion, and I think that Sean Fain represents that, but I think there will be many Sean Fains across the union, across all the unions. I think that this is the time for it.
No, I couldn't agree with you more, brother. There was a quote I recently came across from none other than Thomas Paine, one of the greatest figures involved in the founding of our country, who said that nothing convinces more than time.
Mm.
Rational argumentation is good, but time convinces. And when you translate that into the Marxist lexicon, it means that it's material conditions ultimately
Mm,
that produce these massive societal changes in consciousness, and um, the American people are getting hit very hard,
mm,
and the era where the middle classes just thrived and there was some sense of stability, and you had a part of the labor force that was bourgeoisified. That era is gone. People are reproletarianized. Necessity is back as a reality for the vast majority of the working class. And it's no doubt that when you see these polls in terms of the favorability of unions, which are not just any unions, they're expressing favorability for the militant unions, right?
mm,
The change has been directly correlated to that move away from fortress unionism, from the unions that represent, in many ways, more so the interests of the boss than of the workers, the unions that were the product of a whole generation or two of State Department attacks on communists within unions, the destruction of the CIO. Um, Now we're seeing a change that's conjoined with this more militant unionism. How do you see this unfolding? Where just like you were able to kind of see that one of the first few plants would be in Tennessee and Volkswagen. Are there any other that you have on your um, on your list, which is a pretty good thing to bet on?
I think that, well, I think first and foremost, I've already mentioned O'Brien and the Teamsters. I think that there's probably going to be a doubling down on that sort of path that they're already on, that trajectory. But I think that by in a way, the most equatable to what the UAW has accomplished is going to be militant resurgence and sort of productive, expressly production based unions. I think is probably the logical step because it's the most equatable to what the UAW workers do and the conditions and the contracts sort of details and everything else that they're signing. So from a standpoint of where is this the most easily replicable, I would be like the USW, the United Steelworkers, and other production-based unions like that. Um, I think that if Sean O'Brien doubles down on his sort of trajectory, I think we could. And we've already seen this as well. And I actually want to address one of the comments after this, but the railroad workers, I could see them. You know, they've already taken some militant stances. We've already seen that, but I think that that movement is going to also probably continue to become more and more radicalized and adopt this sort of leadership styles of Sean Fame. So I think that there is, I think there's a lot of potential, and I think that it'll also be very telling to see when big contracts are being negotiated at present. Um, there is obviously Sean Fain has signaled that he wants to do the sort of general strike in May 1st of, I believe it's 2028. That's why he synced up all the contracts to end on that date, and he's implored other unions to do the same, to line up those contracts so he can attempt to have more than just the UAW, like let's say the IBW or the USW or whatever. These other unions also joining in and saying setting their date, their end date for their contracts to be on May 1st to be renegotiated and everything else like that. I think that as I can kind of hear more about what unions are engaging in that practice, I could probably give you a better answer. But my kind of idea at the time is just going to be it's more production based unions. I don't think like building trades it's going to be as easily translatable. Building trades contracts are extremely different. It would actually even be difficult for building trades contracts to be syncing up their contracts for a May 1st deadline. Even they operate completely different than these more industrial based unions. So there's my sort of prediction. I would say maybe the USW. I think that would be huge. And other similar, production-based unions. But I did want to actually pull up Jesus Christ Superstar had made a comment here. If you want to pull that up on the screen, yeah. So I haven't read the critique that the Socialist Alternative put out because I don't read trot newspapers because I don't waste my time. But one thing I will say is that I'm I'm talking about Sean Fain in a very positive manner. This is actually a area that I very much critique him in, and I have made a statement previously, but I don't know what the socialist alternative said, but I'll just give you my own critique, which is that uh, Would I have preferred that Sean Fain just kind of said nobody earned our endorsement? I'm not endorsing anybody. Absolutely. I think it would have set a massive precedent. I think it would be huge. I think it would be, extremely bold thing to do. And I think it would really signal massive shakeups in the establishment. However, Sean Fain is a union boss. He's still expected, to make an endorsement. His own people inside internally in the UAW expect him to make an endorsement. I think I think that's more or less why, and I think he obviously in his own specific interest of being, in the union, I think for his own benefit, or not his own benefit, but for the union's benefit, an endorsement of Biden made the most sense. Biden has talked about, the CARE Act and stuff like that, which would very much loosen up the restrictions on trade union organizing in the country. So it's a strategic thing. Also, I love what Sean Fain's doing, and I think he's on the right path. But Sean Fain is not a communist. Sean Fain is not a socialist. He works within the liberal hegemony. Trade unions themselves work within the liberal hegemony. They have a specific relation between the union and the employer that if capitalism was done away with tomorrow, the unions would not exist in the current capacity they do. They have a vested interest in the continuing of, the liberal hegemony. That's just a reality. But we should still herald, the winning of these massive concessions for working class people. We should still analyze them. We should still, speak positively of them and the people who are making it happen. But that doesn't change the fact, and I actually talked about this when I was in Chicago with Slava, ironically, who's coming on next. But when I was in Chicago giving my speech about Walter Reuther and the and Sean Fain and the modern, sort of parallel between the two of them, which is that the unions are not a revolutionary vanguard party. They're never going to be. They cannot fill that role. That is not the role that they're meant to play. Um, they're not going to take a strong stance one way or the other against the hegemony in that capacity, but they are extremely important for the creation of vanguard parties and organizations because, as Lenin says, they're the schoolhouse of communists. And I explained there, it means two things. It means that they're if a worker has achieved trade union consciousness, it's not that much more difficult to bring them from trade union consciousness to class consciousness. But in addition to that, communists who are already communists can very much train their organizing skills within the trade union movement itself. So it works in many different ways, and it only benefits us that the trade unions are strong. But once again, that does not mean that trade unions are explicitly going to be, fighting Biden or even really delivering more than statements and condemnations of certain policies and acts. I mean, obviously, Sean Fain is not pleased about Biden, and the Democrats destroying the railroad strike potential that was there. He's also come out against, U.S. support for the genocide in Gaza, which is, monumentous and should be applauded. But to think that Sean Fain can influence Biden to change either of those things is not a proper reading of the room. Sean Fain is still just the president of the UAW. He's not president of the United States. So that's just kind of how it works. I'm not making an excuse. Like I said, I think that I would have much more preferred he not endorse anybody. I think that would have been the correct move in a lot of ways. But also, I don't know what Sean Fain's got cooking up behind the scenes. I'm only an outside observer, and I'm trying to offer some amount of rationale behind why that happened. So, do you have anything to add, Carlos, about that?
No, no, that was beautifully said. Thank you so much for coming on, Kyle. The Midwestern Markets Institute's official chief labor analyst. Insight is brilliant. I hope it's well received by the audience and that the people actually take the things you say into consideration because, as we've shown, there's a tremendous predictive capacity in it. So, thank you so much for coming on, brother.
Absolutely, anytime.
All right. Well, that was Kyle Pettis discussing some of the recent developments in the labor movement and specifically the historic organizing of the Volkswagen plant down in Tennessee. Next up, we have a very special guest, a good friend of the Institute, a Ukrainian Marxist-Leninist, which is not the sort of individual I think you usually find either in mainstream media or in so-called independent left-wing media. A good friend of the Institute, Slava, the Ukrainian communist, a correspondent for our friends over at the Revolution Report, and a member of the Chicago's Workers' School. And to conduct this interview with me, a very familiar face, Comrade Eddie Smith, the Liger himself. Thank you so much, Slava, for coming on.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
It's truly a pleasure. We should have done this a very long time ago. We're happy to have you on. Slava, can you tell the folks watching, many of whom I'm guessing have never heard a Ukrainian communist speak, especially one that has your analysis of the unfolding events in the proxy war against Russia. How did you come to the positions that you hold, and how are you generally interpreting the ongoing proxy war against Russia?
Sure. This my Marxist evolution wasn't easy or simple, I would say. I grew up in Western Ukraine, and I came to United States. I immigrated when I was already an adult. So I already formed all of my kind of world views being in Ukraine. And then I moved here, and I was not political at all. I was actually highly religious. I was Jehovah's Witness for many years. I was going door to door preaching. And Jehovah's Witness, they are not into politics. They're actually prohibited from being interested. So I didn't know nothing. I mean, I knew that the name of the president, and that's basically it. Even though when I was in high school, I witnessed the first coup that happened in Ukraine. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Orange Revolution. That's the first time when foreign entity, Western powers meddled in Ukrainian business, and they prevented the legitimate president. Actually, the person who won the elections, they removed him. They said, no, these were not good elections. It was rigged, and they did round two, which was unconstitutional according to Ukrainian constitution. And they put in place this other guy whose wife was Ukrainian American from Chicago. So she was part of diaspora. She was working for American government, and I think she was the actual president, not her husband. Like, she was ruling. But, back then, women were not welcomed in politics. So therefore, they needed male. So that was the first time that I witnessed something weird happening in Ukraine, right? This was 2003, 2004. I was finishing high school, and I remember our teachers dragging us outside and saying we have to go and wear these orange flags because there was Orange Revolution, and we had to say yes to the Yushchenko. Yushchenko was the name of that president who they have installed, and this was not a good experience. I was like, even though I was not political, I realized something is wrong. Like, it's not a good idea that things like that happen, right? And then I moved here to United States. I quit being Jehovah's Witness for various reasons. And I started dating my now husband, who was a Marxist for many years. I didn't know he's a Marxist. And little by little, we had, many conversations about religion first, then about politics. And this was 2013, 14. That's exactly when Maidan was happening. And maybe if Maidan wasn't happening at that time, I wouldn't be so interested in politics, right? But because it was happening in my own country, and I was homesick, of course, as every immigrant. First few years, I came here in 2011, so this is just 2 years after. I was still missing home and nostalgic, and seeing my country being on fire, basically, right? Things were happening. So many people were killed on Maidan by those snipers and stuff like that. So it was really painful to watch. In the beginning, I thought this is organic uprising because, many people who I knew personally, they when some of my family members like traveled to Kiev and participated in that uprising, and they had legitimate concerns and grievances. Yanukovych was not a saint. He was corrupt, just like any other politician in Ukraine. So people had reasons to protest. And when I see people protest, I mean, naturally you want to be on the side of people. But then I started seeing Molotov cocktails being thrown at the police. I started seeing those weird elements, like right sector with swastika on as their wristbands. I started seeing the Svoboda party, which was so fringe. It was like not popular. Svoboda party translates as freedom, and ironically, that's the Nazi party. And its leader, Oleg Chaghnebok, he has been pictured many times doing Heil Hitler movement. We all know what that is, right? And he have said many controversial things aligning with the Nazi ideology. So I saw this guy going on stage with the rest of the coup government, and then American politicians went there and also went on stage with this guy and shake hands and said, "Oh, we're supporting this, fight for democracy," and stuff like that. So that's when I started realizing that, okay, this is not organic. This is being pushed on Ukrainian people, and Ukrainian people are getting used and betrayed, because as soon as that coup happened, then lots of bad things started unraveling in Ukraine. Ukraine went into the civil war, and it was just crazy to witness for 8 long years. So after I witnessed that happening in my country, I was really like trying to analyze why it is happening and are there any examples of such color revolutions. And that's when my husband started telling me, yes, there was a rose revolution in Georgia, there was Arab Spring and stuff like that. And so that's how I developed my Marxist knowledge. And then I started reading some texts, and when SMO started 2 years ago, I really decided that it's time for me to speak against all of that, what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's fascinating to hear. I mean, especially because we've studied the Orange Revolution and Euromaidan from an outsider's perspective, but to hear that, your perspective of being in school and having to wave the orange flags or whatever for the Orange Revolution, this is really interesting. I have kind of a little bit of an out there question, but for those who don't know, I think this is during the Orange Revolution or during an election shortly after, Viktor Yushchenko was poisoned and his face turned into this. And actually that made him go up in the polls, and I believe, and helped him win the election. So what do you make of that?
Well, I think this was a gimmick. It wasn't real. I mean, it's easy to pull off. This was done during the first cycle of elections. So, each elections in Ukraine, there's 2 cycles. And if in the first one there's no clear winner, then the 2 people who got the most votes, they go to the second round. And I think it was in between those rounds, or maybe when Yanukovych started, it was clear that Yanukovych is winning. That's when they staged this poisoning, and they blamed it on Yanukovych, and they said that this is Russia trying to eliminate freedom fighter and pro-democracy candidates, pro-EU, pro-NATO, because this guy, this Yushchenko, he was promising so many things. He said, we're going to join NATO, we're going to be part of EU, we're going to be this and that, we're going to get salaries just like in Europe. And so people fell for it, and I don't blame them. Ukraine, this is beginning of 2000s, right? Ukraine just went through crazy period of time. 90s were horrific. After the dissolution of Soviet Union, the economy was so bad in Ukraine that people were starving. People were surviving in any possible way. Going into 2000s, things got a little bit better, but still not as much. And a lot of people, especially from Western Ukraine, started traveling, going to other countries as a seasonal labor. And like my mom used to go to Poland and work on farms, and so many, like I know so many people who would travel and try to make some money, right? And you know what happens when people travel? They see how the quality of life abroad. So then they start comparing, and they're like, why can't we have that quality of life? And they start demanding that, naively thinking that if they hear the promise, it's going to become true. But so Yushchenko, he abused these hopes that people had, and he's kind of reminding me Trump. He was the same way Trump is reading the room, right, and saying what people expect him to hear. The same way Yushchenko was doing. He would analyze what people expect, and he would promote it. He would say that. But unfortunately, and we know why, right? None of his promises came true. Actually, so he became president in 2014, and in 2004. I'm sorry, this is prior. So in 2004, and then that was elections, and in 2005 he actually became a president. And Ukraine has 5-year terms. So in 2010 there was another elections, and Yushchenko got the worst result in the whole history of Ukraine. Like he got, I don't know, 5th place or something like that. Even his vice president, Julia Tymoshenko, she got better results than him. So people were really disappointed in Yushchenko. They realized he's not going to fulfill his promises. And so in 2010, when during those elections, Julia Tymoshenko was running against, again, Viktor Yanukovych, the guy who they have ousted in 2004, 2005. This guy, he's like, he didn't give up. I thought that, we're going to not hear from him anymore, because usually that's how it happens. Like if somebody, loses badly and can't, they think they can't compete anymore. But no, this guy was determined. So he ran again, and he had a big support in the east and the south of Ukraine, because he's a Russian speaker, and east and south were always speaking Russian. So he was reading their messages, and he was promising them what they wanted to hear. And people over there identified as Russians, or felt friendly with Russia. Like not necessarily they called themselves Russian, but they didn't want to be enemies with Russia, right? They wanted to be like bring the same kind of relations as during Soviet Union. And so Viktor Yanukovych, he was promising that his party of regions, was really popular in the east and south. And I'm not surprised that he won, because Julia Tymoshenko, she was part of Yushchenko's government, and people were disappointed in Yushchenko and Tymoshenko as well. Also, there were some corruption scandal with Julia Tymoshenko. She actually went to jail. When Yanukovych became president, he threw her in jail. So it was like a big drama happening, but it was all for show. It was not really like genuine. I don't think they were fighting to stop corruption, but they have to like create this illusion that, yes, we're fighting for you, we're trying to deal with these oligarchs and take them under control. This is all just to fool people, just to keep that illusion of the state going. But we all know that behind the scenes they're all friends with each other and go to each other's weddings, just like in United States, Clintons and Trumps, right? They were going to each other's family, and they're like friendly. And but when there's debates, they're dumping dirt on each other. So creating that show again.
it's one big club and we're not in it, as
Yes.
George Carlin famously said. I wanted to ask about but perhaps the pre-high school era. You mentioned you come up with the Orange Revolution. I think one of the things that surprises people when they look into Ukrainian history post the overthrow of the Eastern Bloc is the fact that Ukraine was one of the few places where there was still communist candidates getting elected in the first few years of the 90s. And there's almost like a correlation with like the reemergence of banderism into Ukrainian society, which was it was always there, but there was so much of it abroad in New York, in Canada, and parts of Chicago that I mean, we spoke about this when we last met. That ends up going back to Ukraine, and it kind of overlaps with like the attacks on the Communist Party and so can you speak a little bit about that history and like how there's like a shift away from communism at some point, sympathies with the Communist Party, and how banderism gets like fully reintegrated into Ukrainian society? How does it affect like the myths and the textbooks and how they end up conceiving of this new national identity that's like divorced from Russia somehow? And how does it become like a genuine political force as we saw it happen in 2014?
Sure. Yeah. So the Western and Eastern Ukraine, right? They were not part of Soviet Union. Many people know that from the beginning. Like the Eastern Ukraine was part of Soviet Union from 1922, but then Western Ukraine was part of Poland. Therefore, they were behind in developing their communist ideology, and after World War II, they had to catch up, and it was hard to catch up because, as we all know, in Western Ukraine during World War II, lots of these nationalists collaborated with Hitler, and OUN, which is Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and UPA, which is partisan organization, they were really anti-Soviet. So their driving force was, to kill as many communists as they can, and they were really spreading hate, towards Soviet Union. So that got so rooted in the mentality of population of the Western Ukraine that when World War II finished and Western Ukraine got integrated in Soviet Union, it was not easy to change that, right? So it took decades. First of all, not all of the Nazis were eliminated. Some of them were put in prison, of course, for their crimes, but most of them were rescued by the Western forces. They were taken to Canada and United States, and where I live right now in the city of Chicago, there is a huge Ukrainian diaspora. There is actually Ukrainian villages as one of the neighborhoods with a ton of Ukrainian symbolics. Like if you drive through Ukrainian village, you can see Azov symbols and that flag of Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the black and red flag. You can see that right now hanging on some of the houses and businesses in Ukrainian village in Chicago. So those Nazis were brought here, and they started forming this anti-Soviet propaganda. Also, there were some Nazis who were left in Ukraine and they went underground. So they were kept there as a fifth column. They were helped by the CIA. There is official CIA documents declassified from 2008. They were all declassified, and we can read those documents and see exactly what the CIA was doing, how much they were helping them. They were giving them money, weapons. They were helping them. Yeah, that's the flag. Yeah, and this one too. So yeah, that Nazi ideology was kept on a low flame in Western Ukraine, even though it was part of Soviet Union. Of course, Soviets were fighting with it as much as they could. But then when Soviet Union collapsed, unfortunately, as soon as that happened, these diaspora people they came back to Ukraine and they started forming. They formed in 1991. They formed Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists. They did it in Lvov, which is the capital of Western Ukraine. And they started having these meetings, congresses, conventions, and kind of bringing back nationalism and spreading it among the population of Ukraine, who were for decades, communists. Now they started bringing back and glorifying Bandera, Shushevich, and all those so-called heroes from the 40s. So during 90s, we saw the development of this. It wasn't in a full force because, they had to kind of little by little to do that. And they started with little kids. They figured, adults, they've had Soviet education, so it'll be hard to kind of re-educate them back. So they focused on the kids. And I remember being in school and having my classmates recruited into these summer camps, which were first of all free. Second, they were it was all inclusive. It was for any parent, it was a great deal, right? To send your kid to a camp for free, where the kids will be fed and taken care of. So lots of Ukrainian parents fell for it, and I know some people who went to these camps, kind of like Boy Scouts camps. On one hand, they teach some good things, how to survive, how to start the fire and stuff like that. But on the other hand, it was all mixed with nationalism. So they were teaching them all these slogans and songs and all these nationalist phrases and stuff like that. And they were telling them, Bandera is our father. We have to listen to Bandera. We have to follow his steps. So then in the beginning of 2000s, these kids were started growing up and, growing with this ideology. And that's who right now is Azov and Right Sector and Aidar and all of these groups. That's the children of the 90s, growing up with that ideology. So another thing is you mentioned books. It's so funny how every year we would go to school and none of other books would be new. Like we wouldn't get a new math book or a new, other type of a book, but history books, we would always get new history books and they would be different from the previous one. So basically we saw the revisionism of history happening in front of our eyes. They would eliminate, the Soviet heroes and put Nazi heroes in there. And during 90s, it wasn't as bad, but then beginning of 2000s, it got out of control. And then this guy Yushchenko, who we talked previously about, he actually officially made Stepan Bandera as a national hero of Ukraine. He declared him a hero. And that's when we started seeing Lenin's busts taken down, Bandera's monuments putting up. Also, the streets started getting named after Bandera. Like in the city where I'm from, we have Bandera Street. And we have all of these nationalists, we have streets after them. And then all of the Soviet heroes, we would have a street of Gagarin, named after Gagarin, or some other Soviet figures. Those would get renamed into Bandera streets. It's crazy. And can you believe in the city of Kiev, I'm sure you've heard of Babi Yar. Babi Yar is the brotherly, how do you call that? When there's lots of people buried together. I forgot the term. But you know what I mean. It was lots of Jewish people killed during Holocaust, during World War II. They were killed by Nazis. And so there is a monument, there's a memorial dedicated to that event. Ukrainians named the street that goes to that memorial They named it after Bandera. It's just unbelievable, like the audacity of them doing, like, Bandera is one of the people, he's one of those who committed these crimes, and now they're naming the street that's leading towards this memorial. It's crazy. And I know some Jewish people, Jewish community in Ukraine, they were protesting it, but nothing have happened. Of course, when in 2010,
Slava, was that just in the West, or was that also in the East?
In the East, less, because in the East, people still had that Soviet mentality. They didn't allow this Banderism spreading, and that's probably why after Maidan, they didn't like this new, coup government, and they started protesting against that. So yeah, this was like Western Ukraine, Central, North, where the Kiev is, and it's actually good that in the South and in the East people didn't fall for it. Like I'm glad to witness that. I actually have my aunt. She lives in Donetsk, which is one of these new territories that joined Russia. And after the coup, like she was, my family are all in Western Ukraine, but she was the only one who moved. Her parents moved out a long time ago, so she grew up in the East, and she had a different, worldview as the rest of the family. So when the coup happened, she was speaking against it, and my family stopped talking to her. They denounced her. They said, "Oh, you sold out to Putin, you're Russian agent," and stuff like that. So they didn't want to hear her concerns. They didn't want to listen to what she has to say. They stopped communicating with her. I'm the only one from my whole family who actually keeps in contact with her. And during all these 8 years of civil war, I heard so many stories from her, how Ukraine was bombing Donetsk, targeting civilian areas like bus stops, in the morning, like peak hours, like when people are on their way to work, they would just drop a missile on a bus stop, and they were trying to kill as many people as possible, and they were doing it intentionally to scare people and to, they saw that Russia is not responding, that Russia is not coming to the rescue. So they used those years to instill as much fear in those people. They thought, okay, eventually they'll give up. Like that's what they were hoping for. The president, former president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, who was just before Zelensky, he was president during those some of those years of civil war. There is a famous speech from him where he says, our children will go to school and kindergartens, and your children will be sitting in basements, in bomb shelters, hiding, and we're going to work and have a normal life, and you're not going to have a life. So he was saying that as a president of the country. He was saying it to what he considered his own citizens, who he announced as terrorists, because that whole thing, that war, they didn't even call it a war. They called it anti-terrorist operation. Like now Ukrainians are complaining, don't call it SMO, it's a war, it's not special military operation, we don't agree with it. But weren't you guys also giving it a nickname and calling it anti-terrorist operation? They were calling those people not only terrorists, they were dehumanizing them in any means possible. I remember hearing things like roaches and all kinds of derogatory terms. And they did it because Ukrainian army didn't really want to fight with those people. Like, the whole country is kind of interconnected, right? People have family members living everywhere. So, brother on brother, nobody wanted to do that. So when that operation started, Ukraine had a problem with soldiers. Like there was a lot of people quitting. They didn't want to participate in that. That's when these right wing, these nationalists came to the rescue. So that's when they enlisted right sector. That's when Azov was formed. I think Azov was started in 2015, and all these little groups started forming, these militia groups, and they were little by little integrated into the army. But of course, as soon as some questionable thing happens, they would say, the media would say, no, it wasn't the army, it was these groups, we're no longer with them. So they would like use them as an excuse, that no, it's not us. And throughout that time, some, of course, after Maidan, all Western media were spreading lies about Russia, and all the Russophobic calls were, in all the media, in all the newspapers. Also, after Crimea became part of Russia, everybody was screaming, and all the sanctions were introduced at that time. But occasionally they would point out, like, the crimes of these groups, these Nazi groups, were so big that it was hard to hide, right? So occasionally we would see in Western media that, Azov is a problem. Yeah, Ukraine has a Nazi issue. Like, they would admit it because they couldn't no longer hide it, right? But then when in 2022, special military operation happened, miracle happened. Azov is no longer far right, and Ukraine no longer has a Nazi problem. Western media
It's like
declared.
Al Qaeda when they became moderate rebels, and yeah.
Yeah. Even ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, the Jewish organization, they were publishing about Azov, because Azov leader, Andrei Biletsky, the founder of this group, he was filmed saying, we're the white race, kind of like Nazis were doing, right? The white race, and we have to lead the humanity against the scum of the earth, something like that. I don't remember exact words, but he was saying anti-Semitic things and anti-Muslim. Like, he was hating everyone except white Europeans. Therefore, ADL was rightfully so criticizing him and the whole Azov battalion. But then in 2022, I think in April, so like 2 months after SMO started, suddenly ADL comes out and says, no, Azov are good guys, and we're actually going to help them. So this is when we can draw parallels between Israel and Ukraine. When even during those 8 years of civil war, we saw some Israeli soldiers coming and helping Ukraine, but it was rare. It was still rare. But then in 2022, we started seeing many Israeli soldiers going to Ukraine and helping. So this is when, Zelensky, because Zelensky is Jewish and he's friendly with all the rest of the Zionists, and so he was many times saying he wants Ukraine becomes like a big Israel. So there's a lot of similarities between Ukraine, and not only the fact that they were waging war against the minority, right? The same way as Israel for 75 years, waging war against Palestinians, Ukrainians were bombing their own people in the east of Ukraine, in Donbass area, right? Zelensky have said many times that we want land, like, we don't care about people. It's our land and we're gonna take it back. He said it many times, just like Netanyahu. I've heard Netanyahu, and I think in Jordan Peterson's interview, Netanyahu said, it's our land and we're gonna take it. So that's exactly how Nazis were viewing things. They didn't care about people and the concerns of people and the rights of the people. They just want land and they want control, and they want everybody to submit to their rules. So yeah, Ukrainian Nazism or political neo-Nazism is equivalent to Zionism.
That's really interesting, especially to hear you mention the camps that were set up. And we've covered that before, all these camps that were used to indoctrinate kids with Banderite white supremacist ideology. But actually near me, in a town 25 minutes from my hometown, they set up one of these camps in Wisconsin in the United States. And there was a little bit of controversy in 2021 because they put up a statue of Stefan Bandera. So this is in the United States. They're building symbols to Nazi collaborators and people, nationalists who committed horrific massacres. And this was funded by some wealthy Ukrainian nationalists in Chicago, actually, like Slava, you mentioned that there are quite a few of them there. Actually, in that town too, some kids got in trouble for doing a Sieg Heil during their prom photo. So you got to wonder if there's some kind of connection. Got a big Nazi problem in that town, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, here in Chicago, they even mix religion with politics. Like, there's a ton of churches. I don't even know how many. There's one close to me, and there's like 2 in Ukrainian Village, and some few more in suburbs of Chicago. Many churches, Ukrainian churches, and in the church they're raising money for Ukrainian army. So they're like mixing things up. And in the church, the priests, I mean, I don't go to the church, but I hear from other people how priests are always praying for the Ukrainian soldiers. And it's just so horrific because they're indoctrinating people and children, and it's so sad to observe and witness. But mostly I'm concerned not even about people here, but people who are there back home, because they're actually in the midst of the war, right? And no matter who's right, who's wrong, war is bad. It's horrific. Lots of people are dying. Lots of people get injured. I have some family members who are right now fighting because they were drafted by force. They didn't volunteer, but they had to go. My cousin's father-in-law died last year. He was like, I don't know, 55 years old. They're dragging everyone from 18 to 60. They're saying that the draft age is 25. Like, recently they lowered it. It was 27. Now with this new mobilization bill, it's 25. But I've seen people younger than that. It's just like, if like legally they can't draft you if you're under 25. But if they find an excuse, like, oh, you broke the law, you were listening to Russian music or something like that, like silly things. There was one guy in my city who was driving with his windows open, and he had Russian music. Not only they had drafted him, they also confiscated his vehicle for the needs of the army. It's crazy. Like,
That sounds like a very democratic country, by the way.
very democratic. Yeah, I know. It's really bad, and especially bad when the whole family is like, all men of the family are being drafted. And the survival rate of the soldiers in Ukraine is very low. Like, I remember in Bakhmut, I heard that new conscripts, I think it was like the average of 4 hours. Can you believe? It's ridiculous. It's crazy. But of course, that was a hot spot, Bakhmut. Usually, that's why it's been called a meat grinder, because people didn't survive for long. And with this new mobilization bill, things got even worse, because lots of those people who did survive for 2 years or a year, depending when they were drafted, they were hoping that they would get a break, like they would get demobilized. And that's a normal thing for any country that's waging war, right, to rotate their soldiers and give them a break. Not in Ukraine. this bill denied the opportunity for those who have been serving to go back home and get a break. So they have to stay where they are, no demobilization. And there were other ridiculous thing passed, like all men now have to carry a military registration with them at all times. So if they are stopped at any given moment, if they're stopped on the street by patrol, which there is a checkpoints everywhere in Ukraine. You can't get out of the city without passing by one of the checkpoints. It's kind of like in Nazi Germany, like your papers, please. So now every man has to carry the military registration. Not every man have had military registration, because some men are just coming to age, right? So they have to go through that process. When you get 18, you have to go register, go through medical exam and stuff like that. Also, many men have been like, they got excused from draft, because even prior to the war, Ukraine is one of those countries that has a draft. So like every man of 18 has to go and serve for a year. Kind of, I think in Israel they have that too, but in Israel I think it's 2 or 3 years. In Ukraine and Russia and post-Soviet countries, it's a year. And most of the men who had served before, so they have the military registration. And then the men who didn't serve, but they were excused from service for whatever reason, I don't know, religious reason, like I know Jehovah's Witnesses, they don't serve. So they would get the, how you call those, like a work for the city. They would go sweep the streets or something like that. So that was the excuse for not going to serve. And then some people for medical reasons were excused. Now all of them, no matter what the reason was, they have to go through re-evaluation. So they have to go again and get their papers redone. And now the medical commissions have to again look at them and say, oh, are you really disabled, or maybe you're faking it? And of course, now the rules are much stricter. So like if 20 years ago, a guy could get, I don't know, for flat food, he could get excused for not serving. Now, you get flat food or some, I don't know, some other minor issue, you're going. They're drafting people with Down syndrome, with autistic people. So I know my classmate, actually, he was the only person I knew when I was going to school who had some sort of a syndrome. I didn't know at that time what it was. It could have been Down syndrome or something along that line. I just heard like a few weeks ago, my mom told me that he was drafted. I'm like, no way. I mean, I remember him. He couldn't even dress himself. How can they draft him? It's impossible. But I guess his family couldn't bribe the proper person and get him out, because you have to understand that it's the war of the poor. If you are well-to-do, if you're making enough money and you have connections, you can buy your way out of it. But if you're a regular worker, you have to be, you're just going to be used. It's yeah, literal cannon fathers, 100%, Jenny. It's so true. And I've noticed that the morale of the population in Ukraine was really high in the beginning, because you have to understand, when when the war starts, everybody's emotional and everybody's like, yeah, we're gonna defend the country, we're gonna fight. As the time goes by, that morale is dropping, because they see their family members dying. They see injured, like another family member of mine, he lost his leg, so now he's disabled. And so people witness all of this, and they get disappointed, and they see that there's no end to this. So little by little, people are voicing their discontent, and I just hope that more and more people will be speaking out. So far, I mean, there are some, but it's very risky in Ukraine to speak out. we know what happened to brothers Kononovich. I mean, they got arrested. Right now, they're under house arrest. But there are many people who who were speaking out, like Gonzalo Lira. He wasn't a Marxist, but he was American citizen living in Kharkov, and he was speaking against Ukrainian government. And I don't know what exactly happened to him, but he died in custody. So nobody, yeah, that's the brothers Kononovich. um the the communists who were in Ukraine had to flee the country. They had to run away. So Ukrainian Communist Party, as you said, Carlos, earlier, they were very popular in 90s. So after the dissolution of Soviet Union, kind of like the Russian Communist Party was popular and still is. But in Ukraine, with the rise of Banderism, the Communist Party was losing its popularity. And then when Maidan happened, some of them left the country. And then when SMO started, the leadership also ran away, because these Bandera guys, they were coming after them. They were ready to assassinate them. And so Peter Simonenko, that's the leader of Ukrainian Communist Party. I heard he's in Belarus. I'm not sure if that's true, but these are just rumors. And there are some like few socialist movements in Ukraine, but they all became, eventually they got co-opted and they became like national socialist kind, so it's just hard to witness that. Before they were speaking the right things, they were saying right things, and then when SMO started, they, I don't know, out of fear or out of ether, I don't know how, but things have changed, unfortunately. And I just hope that Ukrainian population will rise up and stop this nonsense. But it kind of seems that things are moving in that direction, because I'm sure you've heard Tony Blinken is in Ukraine today. And he's been in Ukraine, I think last September. So that was right after the failed counteroffensive, which was supposed to be spring counteroffensive. It became summer counteroffensive, and they failed anyway. Blinken came to fix the things up, I guess, to save the day. It's usually like that. Like when things go bad, it's either Victoria Nuland goes, the Cookie Queen, Cookie Monster, or the Blinken. And this year, Blinken wasn't coming. He's been to Israel like 8 times since beginning of the year, but he didn't go to Ukraine, and now he went. So I assume because of the advances in Kharkov area. So it seems like they're either going to stage something again, because remember 2 years ago, in the beginning of the special military operation, Russian forces were advancing in Kharkov. They had almost the whole region under control. They were really close to Kiev. And then the peace deal was supposed to happen. So Western media wasn't portraying it like that. They were saying, oh, Russian troops lost and they had to run away from Kharkov. And as they were running away, they raped and killed a bunch of people in Bucha and Izum and Irpin and all of those. I'm sure you've all heard those horror stories. We know it was all staged by the same people who were staging chemical weapons in Syria. It was the same production team. But that was not why Russian troops withdraw. It was supposed to be a peace deal. So it was part of the deal. But then Johnson came to Ukraine and said, no, you're not signing it. So Russian side, they have fulfilled what they were supposed to do, right? They withdraw their troops, and then Ukraine backed out. And not only they backed out, they also staged those fake horror stories, which are so easy to debunk. I mean, because they weren't like, on one hand, the production was kind of on a higher level than what Zionists were doing in Israel not so long ago, but some individuals forgot to remove the videos from the internet, and whatever goes on the internet stays on the internet, right? So people were able to trace back and say, okay, look at this. Russian forces came out of Bucha on this day, and then Ukrainian forces came in, and then why only on the third day they started showing these dead people on the street. So there were a lot of things that didn't make sense, and some journalists did a great work debunking the official narrative, but the mainstream media never picked it up. They still to this day repeat the lies, and I'm sure now they're going, because there's developments in the same area, Kharkov region. I assume that all of those lies will be brought back, and that's probably why Blinken is there, to give the directions and say, okay, you do this, you do that. We're going to save the day and save the situation. Most likely, that's why he's there, because otherwise, what would he be doing? He would be in Israel helping them, I guess.
Yeah, it's I mean, most of the specialists that I've been reading, the military specialists, they seem to predict that at some point in the summer, like this is probably going to be a done deal. And we just saw a bill pass. I think it was like around 70K or so, 70,000, 70 billion that went to, excuse me, that went to Ukraine. The total bill was like 95 in total between Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan. Excuse me if I got my numbers wrong, but I mean, the U.S. was just like recently scavenging around the world in like Saudi Arabia to see where the hell they can find weapons from to send to Ukraine. Like there literally isn't. Europe has basically gone through its stock weapons, and they don't produce them very quickly because, in case the folks forgot, like we outsource most of our productive industry, and when you really look at the military spending, it's kind of all like a little pyramid scheme, and even the spending, like the biggest chunk of it is just going to military contractors, and it's coming out of taxpayer pockets. So, I mean, I want to ask you a question. You have this new movement to continue conscripting more and more people. I even heard that they're going into some of the countries in Europe where Ukrainians have fled to, and kicking them out to actually be conscripted. And it's so absurd. It's like it's a literal meat grinder. You mentioned that in Bakhmut, which is one of the hot areas, like it took 4 hours for like on average people to die. Um, I can I can't imagine it being the case that at some point the Ukrainian population doesn't like reflect and think, hey, the West has literally thrown us into a meat grinder. They've destroyed maybe most families in the country that have at least lost an uncle, a father, a grandfather, a child. Um, Hundreds of thousands have died. Like the numbers that the West put out are like a fraction of what
Yeah.
has really gone on. It's so horrific. What are like the sort of concrete likelihoods that the Ukrainian people, even in the West, just say, we've been used like cannon fodder by the West. It's time that we abandon it. Is that likely at all anytime soon?
Um, what I've noticed is those who are in Ukraine, because they're right there, right? Their life is in danger, and especially for men, they can be drafted at any given moment. They're starting to oppose it and show the dissatisfaction with what's happening. But those who fled, those who are abroad already, so they're safe, to the certain degree, of course, they are the most vocal supporters of the army, and they're like, yes, let's continue to fight. We have to crush Russia, and we will win. And it's always been like that. When you remove yourself from that and from the side, it's easy to talk. It's easy to analyze it. So I hear people, in the United States, in Europe, Ukrainians are so bold and brave from a distance, and there's screaming and shouting that Ukraine will win. But people in Ukraine actually are not that optimistic. And I think, like you mentioned, because right now part of that new mobilization bill is also the fact that Ukrainian consular agencies abroad, right, will not renew paperwork for men of drafting age anymore. So now all of these people, all of the men who escaped, now if their passport is expired, which they will be soon, I mean, passports have tendency to expire, and other paperwork too, they won't be able to fix their paperwork. That means they won't be mobile anymore. They can't travel. And all of them, they don't have legal status. They have a temporary refugee kind of, here in United States, they had this program called U4U, United for Ukraine. And they advertised it as such a goodwill, like, we're such a good guys. Please, Ukrainians, come here. We'll save you. In reality, it's not as easy as they say. In order for anyone from Ukraine to actually come here with that, to be eligible for that program, they had to have a sponsor. So some American citizen who makes enough money to cover, like, the requirements are you have to make 125 a federal minimum for this many people. So everybody in your family included, plus the people who you're trying to sponsor. And you have to make that much money, show, like, prove that you're a good citizen, go through background check and all that kind of stuff. Like, so much bureaucracy. I went through that with two people. I had to sponsor friends of mine, and it was hell. It was so hard to do it. But I mean, I'm happy I was approved and they were able to come, and they weren't drafted because these were young guys and I didn't want them to die. It's just, that's the time when I realized that, they're saying that, yes, we're helping these people. And same with European countries, the European garden, as they call it, right? They're portraying it as this beacon of democracy. We're so good, we're helping everyone. But in reality, when it comes to it, they're not helping. They're actually making it harder and harder for people to escape from Ukraine. So now, like, before, there were ways to get out through forests and fields, and people were escaping any means possible. They would, like, they would forge, like, volunteer papers or some, like, student papers. Like, lots of men got second education. They enrolled again in colleges and stuff because they weren't taking students for a while. But one by one, Ukrainian regime had cut those opportunities, and they clamped down, and they really tried to control every exit, every possible means of escape. It's so hard now that I don't know. And even those people who were drafted and who were sent to fight, I heard, I don't know how true that number is, but I heard that 100,000 of Ukrainian men have escaped their military posts. So they were drafted, they were sent, and then they disappeared. So they escaped. So that kind of tells me that things are changing. People don't want to die anymore. So I'm hopeful. I really think that this summer, probably fall, the only thing what's bothering me is I understand why things are developing in Kharkov region, because that's the area from where they are sending missiles to Belgorod, the Russian territory. I'm sure you've heard so many people are dying. But I'm surprised, and I don't understand why, but I'm not a military expert, so I don't know all these details. I was assuming that this year, Russia is going to advance in Odessa region to build the land bridge to Transnistria and to basically cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea, because Odessa is also highly Russian, like they're Russian speaking, and they identify themselves as Russians. So I was under assumption that that's going to be a next development, but we're not seeing that happening. Even though Transnistria is kind of in danger. Moldova has been encroaching and trying to take over, but there's Russian peace troops, I think they are stationing, so nothing bad is happening as of now, but who knows? We could see anything in near future. Also, another two regions of Moldova, one is called Gagauzia and one I don't remember the name, but they have recently called on Russia for help, because the Moldovan government is another Western puppet regime, and they have been abusing their power, and they're not allowing people to speak Russian. Like, there's lots of people in Moldova who speak Russian, and Moldova has been interfering with their daily life, right? So the leader of that Gagauzia region, I forgot her name, but she recently flew to Moscow. She met with Putin and she asked for help. So putting two and two together, we may see, I'm not 100% sure, but it kind of seems to me that it would be probably, if Russia takes Odessa region, then they would have access, land bridge to Transnistria, plus they would be able to help those Moldova regions. But I don't know how that would affect, the EU and Russia relations. I mean, that's getting too close, right? Romania is right there, and it's part of EU. So I'm not sure. Maybe Russia really needs to take Kharkov region and kind of secure the whole east before they advance in the south. I don't know. We will see, I guess. But that's the possible development in the near future in Ukraine.
So, how do you see the Ukrainian state? Like, do you see it surviving after this? Because it seems like, I mean, the original intentions of the SMO were denazification and demilitarization, and you can't complete those objectives if the Ukrainian state, as it was designed and pressured into existence by the West, continues to exist in that form. So, how do you see how do you see Ukraine in a post-war? Do you see it existing as an independent state? And if so, in what manner, and what sort of influence would Russia have to have over it to prevent re-Nazification and remilitarization? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's two possibilities. One is to have a small Ukraine, which would be those few Western states that actually speak Ukrainian. There's only a few of them, I think 5 or 6. The state I'm from, Ivano-Frankovsk, then the Lvov region, and a few more. That's the actual Ukraine. That's where people speak Ukrainian and have a little bit different culture from the rest, right? So part of me, because I grew up in there, I wouldn't want that area to become part of Poland and the other state right next to mine to become part of Hungary and the other one become part of Romania. Like, you don't want that to, that breakdown to happen, because yes, originally hundreds of years ago, that area was part of Austria-Hungary Empire. It was part of Polish Empire. So there are people who speak Polish, there are people who speak Hungarian and other languages, but that's a minority now. Majority speaks Ukrainian. So I'm sure the Ukrainians who live there, they do want to preserve their culture and the language. Unfortunately, their culture and language got co-opted with this neo-Nazism, and they have abused it so much that now every folk song has a different meaning. Now it has the meaning of what they have inserted in it, right? Originally it wasn't like that, but then they co-opted it. So one possibility is it being broken down between Poland and Hungary and others. Another, I think, it would be the small Ukraine with some, as Putin has called, gray area, right? Some break area in between. I'm not sure what that would look like. It's hard to imagine because I haven't seen that happening anywhere else. But as far as denazifying, I can't even imagine. This ideology is so deeply rooted right now, unfortunately. It would have to be people themselves to go through that change. And the change, I mean, we know everything is happening not because of people, not because of identity politics, but because of the changes in the environment and socioeconomic changes. So it takes generation. Usually, change takes generations. So, like everything else in this world, Ukraine will have to go through this dialectics, right? The changes, and I assume it will be in maybe 20, 40 years that we will see that change. But I can't. I don't think it will happen anytime before that. And just like with other conflicts that Western Empire was involved in, after the conflicts somewhat ended, right? There's always this, like, it goes in the back burner, right? But it's never really ended. There's always some little sparks happening. We've seen that in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've witnessed that in Syria. For how many years? That there's still conflict is happening in Syria, right? So most likely we will see maybe 5 or 10 years of this, um, like frozen conflict type of a thing with occasional sparks. And that's probably what's going to help in changing the mentality of people. But I assume it's not going to end abruptly and like right away everything is changing. That's not how it happens, unfortunately. So we have to get ready for a long period. Like we won't stop hearing about Ukraine for another 10 years at least. That's my assumption.
Interesting. I bet you're right. Just based on what I know about Ukraine and based on my understanding of how deeply rooted the ethno-nationalist ideology is in Ukraine, and hearing from you has been super informative. I think I've heard 2 historical recaps now of what led up to the war in Ukraine. I've heard one from you, and then I've heard another from Vladimir Putin on Tucker Carlson's show. So our last question of the day, I was wondering what you thought of Putin's historical recap. If you have any criticisms of it or anything you would have added, or just your thoughts.
The 30-second one, by the way, it was a great 30-second recap, just real quick. Boom, it's 15 minutes.
Well, do you want me to be like Putin or? No,
You're
I
free to
won't.
go as long as you want, honestly.
Yeah, so Putin, there are certain things that I agree with him, of course, but he I understand where he's coming from. He's coming from his national chauvinistic position, just like Ukrainian nationalists have twisted the history to fit their narrative. Putin is no exception. I mean, there are Russian chauvinists, national chauvinists in Russia, so it's no surprise. They're going to twist the history to kind of match, their patriotism and stuff like that. So Ukrainians and Russians, of course, have the same roots. We all come from Kievan Rus, and Ukrainians like to take it all for themselves and say, "No, we are the true descendants. Kievan Rus was ours," and then Russians say, "No, it was Russian," and they always fight about it. And poor Belarusians are out of that equation, even though it wasn't just. It's not just Ukraine and Russia taking roots in Kievan Rus. Belarus, the whole territory of Belarus was also part of it. But we never hear their point of view. It's always Ukrainians and Russians are fighting, just like they fight for, I don't know, some other cultural stuff like music and food. They fight who invented pierogies, who invented borscht, and all kinds of other stuff. That's funny to observe. Regarding the Putin's version of history, he's correct that about the second period of time, like what was right before the Soviet Union. That I agree with him. Even though he failed to mention that like he was blaming the Polish abusing Ukrainians, but he didn't admit that Russian Empire was also abusing their peasants, and minorities. I understand, nobody wants to bring the mistakes, but he doesn't have to, because that's not Russia, that's Russian Empire. It was feudalism. It was different, different times.
And that would have reflected very nicely on him to be able to say, like, this is how we have historically fucked up. And
yeah, he did criticize Lenin. So I'm like, oh, well, you're criticizing Lenin. Why don't you criticize Russian Empire? Like, so that was my disagreement with him. Another thing is he says, and I think Russian nationalists in general, they like to claim that there was no Ukrainians until 19th century. And I disagree with that because there are historical evidence. And, after Kievan Rus collapsed and it broken down in different, like, Kiev became separate from Novgorod, which was like, Novgorod was like a northern capital of Kievan Rus, and that was the Russian city. So eventually the Moscow Empire, Moscow Kingdom, formed over there in the north, and then Kiev was on its own, and then the Zaporozhye Cossacks, they had like this fortress, which they called Zaporozhye Siege, and they were fighting with all of the neighboring nations and waging wars and trying to, and Zaporozhye Cossacks are the ones who were, that was the beginning. They were starting to call themselves Ukrainians, which Ukraine means on the edge, right? So it was at that moment, Ukrainian language, of course, was different from the modern Ukrainian language. Same as Russian language was evolving. Before in Kievan Rus, they were all speaking this old Slavic language. And then when they moved apart, they were kind of developing isolated from each other, relatively isolated. Of course, they've been in contact, but that's how languages evolve. That's how change happens. For 4 centuries after the collapse of Kievan Rus, these Zaporozhye Cossacks were separate from Russia. And then when they had trouble fighting with Poles and they couldn't win, they asked Russia, who became strong by that point, they asked for help. That was 1654, I believe, when Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky, he signed the treaty. It was called Pereyaslav Treaty. That's when they asked Russia to save their butt. And from then on, is Ukraine kind of became the part of Russian Empire. That treaty wasn't supposed to be like that. They were supposed to have autonomy. But then as the time progressed, they were, they didn't like the rules of Russian Empire. So they started, like, it was inside fighting. And I'm sure you've heard of Catherine the Great. She was a strict ruler and she didn't tolerate the Cossacks Uprisings, and she really put them down. So from then on, so this is 18th century, I think she was the ruler, so 17 something till 19 something. So for those 200 years, that's when Ukrainians, the East and South were part of Russian Empire. The West was still part of Rzecz Pospolita, which was Polish Empire, and both sides were oppressed. Just like we know that happens. The peasants get oppressed by the feudalists. So Putin didn't like to admit that. He was like, no, we were such a good guys. Only Polish were oppressing the Ukrainians. So that's one disagreement. Another disagreement I have with Putin is he's blaming Lenin for creating Ukraine. Like, what? First of all, Ukraine didn't become part of Soviet Union from the beginning. Like, after when the revolution happened in 1917, it's not like overnight Ukraine became part of it. No, it took 5 years. So during those 5 years after the revolution, there was like a nationalist Ukraine state. There was so many different versions of Ukraine. You can find like 10 different maps with different borders. At one point, Ukraine had included that the city of Belgorod, which right now is getting hit a lot, and we hear it in the news. Also, Kuban region, which is like after the Azov Sea, which is also now Rostov-on-Don. Maybe you heard that city. That area was at some point part of Ukraine. So it was like changing a lot. Kharkov, actually, I don't know if you're familiar with that. Kharkov was the first capital of Soviet Ukraine. That's when Soviets established Ukraine in 1918, I believe, their first attempt. So the nationalists had Kiev as the center of power, and then Kharkov was the hub of the Bolsheviks, and they were fighting back and forward for 5 years. And then finally, Bolsheviks won, and in 1922, Ukraine became part of Soviet Union. And Lenin, I mean, Bolsheviks, and not just Lenin, he wasn't the only one making the decision, of course. They decided to give Ukraine those borders that were the most accepted by the population. So that's why Donbass became part of Ukraine. You have to understand that they didn't envision this, what's happening right now. They thought that these will be brotherly nations living in peace forever and ever, and nobody's going to fight. And they really gave so much freedom to Ukrainians. The era of Ukrainization came, right? Lenin recognized the mistakes of Russian Empire, and he really wanted to please the Ukrainian people and say, hey, we're not going to oppress you like those guys, the Tsarists. We're going to let you speak Ukrainian. We're going to let you do, practice your culture. Putin is criticizing, unfortunately, Lenin for that. And I hope eventually he'll realize his mistake. And it seems like Putin is changing a bit, like we all know that Putin of 20 years ago is different from right now. 20 years ago, he was still trying to please the West. He was trying to become a comprador regime, and he was like, please accept me in your club. And now he's changed a lot because he realized that they're not going to accept him and Russia, right? So he's changing. We see his development, and I just hope that eventually he will reevaluate his knowledge, his version of history, and instead of criticizing Lenin, he'll criticize the Tsarists.
We can only hope. This has been a process I'm officially terming the basedification of Putin over the last 20 years. I think you're completely right. In conjunction to the last two comments that you've made, it's like it seems difficult for the nationalism to go away if it's just a destructive project, an abstract negativity. It's not going to succeed. Like, it has to be conjoined with actually going back and not like reducing Ukrainian history to just Russian history, which seems to be what's implied in Putin's historical recapitulation, which, by the way, folks, there is another position that's not just Putin's and Timothy Snyder's reply on Substack. There's Slava's position, which, I got my money on. But it seems like instead of just like destroying that, it has to be phrased in a positive form, because Ukraine has a very rich history. It played a very important role in Soviet history, and it's got so many progressive figures and important leaders of the Soviet project that it can hark back to and refound its history on. Are there any efforts being made currently to not just tear down the Ukrainian nationalist, basically Nazi retelling of history, but to do it by affirming a positive look at Ukrainian history? Because just real quick, we had a series by one of our Institute's writers, Caleb Apuchet, who is doing a series debunking Ukrainian nationalism. And the Ukrainian diaspora started to really get mad when it wasn't just debunking the lies of the nationalists and the myths, but reasserting the positive history of Ukraine and the communist progressive history of Ukraine. That's when they came after her job and eventually, unfortunately, ended up firing her. So are there any efforts like that of like retelling a positive history of Ukraine that brings a positive content to the dispelling of the nationalist myths?
Well, from what I have seen in the past 2 years, unfortunately, I came across so many, people who took the side of Russia without realizing that, without knowing the history, right? So they would believe the exaggerations from the Russian nationalists, and they would just accept the fact. When I see some tweets saying there is no such a thing as Ukraine, Ukrainian is not a thing, there is no Ukrainian language. I've had people telling me there is no language, Ukrainian language. I'm like, really? Or they say, oh, it's not even different from Russian, or it's just a dialect and stuff like that. It's really hard to see that because I had some arguments with people. I'm like, listen, Ukrainian nationalists have done enough damage to Ukrainian culture. You don't have to add to that. Like, how about we start actually defending the Ukrainians and protect and defend from the nationalism? The only force that I noticed that are doing that stance is the Communist Party of Russian Federation. They are because they understand the history and they understand it from the Marxist point of view as dialectical materialism. So they know that the changes that have happened in Western Ukraine in the last 20-30 years are reversible. It's not the final point. And Ukraine has that Soviet history, and we can bring that back. So I'm really happy that in Russia, KPRF, the Communist Party, has strong position, and they are popular. They're the second popular party. You know how in the West they like to say Navalny was the biggest opposition to Putin. That's why he killed him. But Navalny was nobody. He was like 3% in any election. So and his party, it's the Communist Party who's always come in second, and it's the largest second party, and they have a lot of influence. Actually, it was them who were pushing Putin's party for 80 years. They were saying, we need to help Donbass, we need to help Donbass. So I really hope that with the help of Russian Communist Party, we will be able to prevent the total destruction of Ukrainian culture and a complete takeover by this neo-Nazism. Because I really love my people, I love the culture, and I don't want to see it being completely destroyed. So hopefully.
I think that's a good hopeful note to end it with. As always, it's the communists who stand on the right side of history. We saw this with the CPRF, but also with what's left of the Communist Party of Ukraine, which were also supportive of something like the SMO taking place 10 years prior, so that 14,000 lives that were lost in the Donbass wouldn't have happened. But Slava, this has been a massive pleasure. We've learned so much, and I highly doubt that there's many people in the world that could provide this quality analysis for us in English from a perspective that's not tainted by Western media lies, and that's so informed in Ukrainian history. I want to thank the folks that have been donating to the Institute. We got recently remonetized, which is something we're celebrating. L's been one of our favorites. The name is L, but big old W in terms of donations. Thank you so much for the 10 gifted. Thank you, Andrew Ray. Thank you, Daniel, the People's DJ. Thank you, Andrew Ray, again for the $10. And thank you, ER Silva, for the $10 super sticker. Thank you to all who tuned in. I hope you learned a lot. I know I certainly did. Slava, anything you would like to plug before we go?
I would like to end with a little ad, if you don't mind. For those who are interested in learning more about the origins of the civil war in Donbass, like why exactly Ukrainian government started bombing Donbass and how the Maidan happened. We have a great documentary at the Revolution Report called 8 Years Before. You can find it on our YouTube channel. We went to Donbass, we interviewed people, and they shared their stories. So you can learn from that documentary exactly what was happening in Ukraine prior to the special military operation.
Yeah, I was just looking it up now to link it to the chat. It should be linked to the chat now for everyone watching on YouTube. The documentaries you guys do are just the best. The one that Donald just did on the Georgian color revolution attempt is phenomenal, and hopefully we can have him on sometime this week to talk about that and the arrest. We were supposed to talk to him the day he got arrested.
Yeah,
I don't know if he got to tell you that. So that was
it was crazy.
We're
We were
happy.
so worried about him.
Yeah. So hopefully there'll be more collaborative efforts between some of us at the Institute in conjunction with the Revolution Report and the Chicago Workers School over there in that region. We had Eddie go sometime last year to an event, and earlier this year, Kyle Pettis, who was on the show earlier today, attended and gave a great presentation on labor history. So hopefully more of that as well. But
For sure.
Thank you so much, Slava, for coming on. Thank you, Eddie, for joining us, of course. And thank you to the audience. We'll roll out with our new and improved folky version of the International. See you, folks.
Stand up, all victims of oppression, for the tyrants fear your might. Don't cling so hard to your possessions, for you have nothing if you have no right. Let racist ignorance be ended, for respect makes the empires fall. Freedom is merely privilege extended, unless enjoyed by one and all. So come, brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The International unites the world in the song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race. Let no one build walls to divide us, walls of hatred nor walls of stone. Come greet the dawn and stand beside us. We'll live together or we'll die alone. In our world poisoned by exploitation, those who have taken, now they must give. And end the vanity of nations, we've but one earth on which to live. So come, brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The International unites the world in the song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race. And so begins the final drama, in the streets and in the fields. We stand unbowed before their armor, we defy their guns and shields. When we fight, provoked by their aggression, let us be inspired by light and love. For though they offer us concessions, change will not come from above. So come, brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The International unites the world in a song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The International unites the human